The fourth floor had a reputation, not the kind hospitals advertised in brochures, not the kind donors funded, not the kind administrators mentioned during tour. It was the kind of reputation people whispered about, the kind new employees heard during orientation, the kind that made experienced nurses quietly request transfers. Officially, it was called the Veterans Recovery Unit. Unofficially, everyone called it something else. The graveyard, not because people died there, because careers did, nurses transferred, therapists quit, doctors rotated out whenever possible, nobody stayed long, nobody wanted to, and according to hospital legend, nobody survived a month. Emily Carter heard the warning before she even stepped off the elevator. The doors slid open. The smell hit first. Coffee, disinfectant, old carpet, and something harder to describe, exhaustion. The entire floor felt exhausted. Like it had been fighting the same battle for years and no longer expected to win. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped into the hallway. Immediately she noticed the silence, not normal hospital silence. This silence felt different, heavy. A television played somewhere in the distance. A nurse pushed a medication cart down the hall. Two orderlies walked past without speaking. Everything felt muted, like the entire floor was holding its breath. A woman at the nurse's station looked up. "Can I help you?" Emily smiled. "I'm Emily Carter." The woman's expression changed instantly. "Oh, a pause. You're the new nurse." Emily nodded. The woman stared for several seconds, then slowly leaned back in her chair. "You actually came." Emily laughed softly. "I've heard that twice already today." The nurse didn't laugh. Most don't. Another nurse looked up from a computer. "Last one quit after 12 days. A third voice joined the conversation. "The one before that lasted 19? Emily blinked. "Seriously?" Nobody answered because they were serious. The first nurse finally stood and extended her hand. "Michelle." Emily shook it. "Nice to meet you." Michelle smiled politely, then pointed toward the hallway. "Just don't get attached." The words felt strange. Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" Michelle hesitated, like she regretted saying it, then shrugged. "You'll understand." Before Emily could ask another question, a loud crash echoed from somewhere down the hall, followed immediately by shouting. A chair scraped across a floor, someone yelled, something hit a wall. The nurse's station didn't react, not even slightly. Nobody ran, nobody panicked, nobody looked surprised. Emily stared. Michelle noticed. "Room 418. The answer sounded routine, like someone discussing the weather. "Is everything okay?" Michelle shrugged. "Depends what your definition of okay is." The shouting continued, then stopped, then started again. A few seconds later, a security guard walked casually past the nurse's station carrying a clipboard. Not running, walking. That told Emily everything she needed to know. This happened often, far too often. She looked back toward the hallway, then toward the nurses, then toward the patient charts stacked near the desk. The first feeling wasn't fear, it was curiosity. Who was in room 418? And what happened to make an entire floor treat chaos like background noise? A few minutes later, she received her assignment packet. 21 patients. Most had military backgrounds. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force. Several had served multiple deployments. Several carried diagnoses that filled entire pages. PTSD, traumatic brain injuries. Chronic depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse histories, sleep disorders, isolation tendencies, treatment resistance. The notes seemed endless. Emily sat down and began reading. By the 10th file, she noticed a pattern. Many of the medical conditions were different. Many of the stories were different, but one phrase kept appearing. Patient disengaged, patient withdrawn, patient refuses participation, patient non-responsive, patient isolated, different words, same meaning. These weren't people who had stopped healing. These were people who had stopped believing healing was possible. The thought stayed with her. An hour later, she attended the morning briefing. A doctor reviewed patient updates. Therapists discussed treatment plans. Nurses exchanged reports. Everything seemed normal, until someone mentioned room 418. The atmosphere changed immediately. A therapist sighed. A doctor rubbed his forehead. One nurse looked away. Emily noticed, then glanced down at her packet. Room 418, Ethan Cole, age 42, retired Navy SEAL, multiple deployments. Severe PTSD. History of aggressive episodes, history of refusing treatment, history of refusing visitors, history of refusing medication adjustments, history of refusing almost everything. The notes stretched for pages. Emily kept reading, then stopped at one sentence. Patient has not participated in voluntary group therapy in 14 months. 14 months. She read it again, then a third time. The doctor noticed. Yeah, Emily looked up. The doctor sighed. Ethan's difficult. Nobody corrected him. Nobody disagreed. The room moved on, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. 14 months. That wasn't resistance. That was surrender. And there was a difference. After the meeting ended, Emily spent the afternoon learning the floor. Patient rooms, medication storage, emergency procedures, staff schedules, the usual first-day chaos. By evening, she found herself standing outside room 418. The hallway was quiet. The door remained closed. Inside, she could hear faint movement, nothing else. She glanced at the chart one more time, then knocked. No response. She waited, knocked again, still nothing. Several nurses watched from down the hallway, not openly, but she noticed. Everyone seemed interested, curious, almost nervous. Emily knocked a third time. The answer arrived immediately. Go away. The voice was powerful, controlled, not explosive, not unstable, just absolute, the kind of voice that expected obedience. Several nurses immediately looked away, as if they'd seen this scene before. Emily remained where she was. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she said calmly, "My name is Emily." Silence. "I'll be working here." Nothing, no response, no acknowledgement. Emily looked at the closed door, then smiled slightly. "I'm not asking for anything." Still silence. "I'm just introducing myself." A long pause followed. Then the voice came again, lower this time, tired, older than she expected. "Don't waste your time." Emily stared at the door, listening carefully, not to the words, to the person behind them. Most people would have heard anger. Most people would have heard hostility. Emily heard something else, defeat. The voice belonged to a man who had already decided nobody could help him. A man who no longer expected anyone to stay. A man who was waiting for another nurse to disappear, just like all the others. Emily looked at the door one last time, then nodded. "Okay." Silence. "I'll come back tomorrow." She turned and walked away. Behind her, the room remained silent. The nurses watching from the station exchanged looks. One shook her head, another laughed quietly. Michelle folded her arms. He's never going to talk to her. Maybe she was right. Maybe she wasn't. But as Emily continued down the hallway, she couldn't stop thinking about something. Nobody survives a month there. That was the warning everyone kept repeating. The strange thing was, for the first time all day, she wasn't sure they were talking about the staff. The next morning, Emily arrived 20 minutes early. Not because she had to, because she couldn't stop thinking about room 418, or more specifically, the voice behind the door. Most people on the floor seemed to view Ethan Cole as a problem, a difficult patient, a constant headache, a man who refused help. Emily wasn't convinced. People rarely fought that hard unless something inside them still cared. The truly dangerous cases weren't the angry ones. They were the ones who stopped caring altogether. As she stepped off the elevator, she immediately noticed something unusual. The hallway was crowded. 3 nurses stood outside room 412. A therapist was speaking quietly with a doctor. An orderly hurried past carrying fresh linens. Nobody looked happy. Emily approached the nurses' station. Michelle looked exhausted. "Good morning." Michelle laughed. "No, it isn't." Emily glanced toward the hallway. "What happened?" Michelle rubbed her eyes. "Room 412. A pause, nightmare episode." Emily nodded slowly. Several patients on the ward experienced severe PTSD-related episodes. Unfortunately, that wasn't unusual. "What happened?" Michelle lowered her voice. "He thought he was back in Afghanistan." Emily followed her gaze. The hallway suddenly felt heavier. Michelle continued. "Took 4 people to calm him down." A pause. "And now he refuses to leave his room." Emily looked toward the closed door, then toward the patient charts, then back at Michelle. "Has anyone checked on him recently?" Michelle blinked. "Why?" Emily shrugged, "Just asking." The older nurse stared at her for a moment, then shook her head. "You're definitely new." Emily smiled. "That's what everybody keeps telling me." For the first time, Michelle smiled back. Later that morning, Emily found herself outside room 418 again, coffee in one hand, patient chart in the other. The hallway was quiet, almost peaceful. She knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. Then she spoke. "Morning, Ethan." Silence. Emily leaned against the wall. "I'm not coming in." "Nothing. I'm just letting you know your breakfast looks terrible." A pause, then what? The voice came through the door, not angry, confused. Emily smiled. "The eggs." Silence. "They look like a crime scene." Several seconds passed, then something happened, something nobody on the 4th floor had heard in a very long time. A short laugh, brief, rough, almost rusty from lack of use, but unmistakably a laugh. Emily stared at the door, surprised, then smiled. Because progress rarely arrived the way people expected. At the nurse's station, Michelle looked up. Was that Ethan? Another nurse froze. I think it was. The two women exchanged stunned looks because they couldn't remember the last time they'd heard laughter coming from room 418. Emily didn't push her luck. She simply nodded toward the door. See you later. Then walked away, no lectures, no therapy, no pressure, just a conversation, if it could even be called that. 3 days later, the first real breakthrough happened. Not with Ethan, with Frank Sullivan, the former Army Ranger in room 426. Frank had a reputation almost as bad as Ethan's. He rarely spoke, rarely left his room, rarely participated in anything. Most days he simply sat near the window staring at nothing. The staff completed their rounds, delivered medications, checked vitals, then moved on. Because nobody knew what else to do. That afternoon, Emily noticed something while reviewing old intake records. A family contact form, most of it was outdated, phone numbers disconnected, addresses changed, but one name appeared several times. Rachel Sullivan, daughter, emergency contact. Emily stared at the page. Then opened another file, then another. A pattern emerged. Frank had removed her contact information 3 separate times, yet every update somehow included it again. Someone kept adding her back. The realization stayed with her. That evening she entered Frank's room. The older veteran sat in his usual chair. Staring out the window, the television was off. The lights were dim. The silence felt permanent. Emily pulled up a chair. Frank didn't acknowledge her. She expected that. Instead of talking, she placed a photograph on the small bedside table, then stood up and left. No explanation, no conversation. No questions, nothing. The door clicked shut behind her. For several seconds, Frank didn't move. Then his eyes drifted toward the picture and froze. It was Rachel, older now, standing beside 2 young children, smiling. The image came from social media, publicly available, perfectly legal, but deeply personal. Frank stared at it for a long time, longer than he intended, long enough for memories to return, long enough for walls to crack. The next morning he appeared at the nurse's station. Nobody had seen him leave his room before breakfast in nearly 6 months. The entire staff noticed. Frank cleared his throat, awkwardly, like someone relearning how to speak. Where'd she get the picture? The room went silent. A nurse nearly dropped a clipboard. Michelle looked genuinely shocked. Frank ignored everyone except Emily. Where? Emily smiled softly. Online. The older veteran looked down. Then back up. She okay? Emily nodded. Looks like it. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Frank whispered something so quietly only Emily heard it. Good. It wasn't much, 1 word, but for the 4th floor, it felt enormous. By the end of Emily's 3rd week, people started noticing small changes. Patients stayed out of their rooms longer. Group sessions had higher attendance. Arguments happened less often. The ward felt lighter, not healed, not fixed, just lighter. The change was subtle but real. And nowhere was it more obvious than room 418. Because Ethan Cole had started leaving his room. Only briefly. Only when the hallway was quiet. Only when he thought nobody noticed. Unfortunately for him, Emily noticed everything. One afternoon, she found him standing near a bulletin board studying old photographs from military charity events. He immediately turned away, like a teenager caught doing something embarrassing. Emily pretended not to notice, which was exactly why he kept standing there. Eventually, he pointed toward one photograph. A young Marine smiling beside a service dog. What happened to him? Emily looked at the image, then smiled. He graduated. Ethan frowned. Graduated what? The program, a pause. He's a firefighter now. The former SEAL stared at the picture longer than necessary. Then quietly asked, seriously? Emily nodded. Seriously. The silence that followed felt different, less hopeless, less final. For the first time since arriving on the 4th floor, Emily saw something inside Ethan's eyes that hadn't been there before. Curiosity, and curiosity was dangerous. Because once people started imagining a different future, they often wanted one. The problem was that neither Emily nor Ethan knew someone had already started paying attention to the changes happening on the 4th floor. Someone from outside the hospital. Someone with connections to the military community. Someone whose name would soon change everything. And 6 months from now, that man would step off an elevator, look around the ward, and ask a question nobody expected. Where's Nurse Emily Carter? A month after Emily arrived, something happened that nobody on the 4th floor could remember happening before. The staff started talking about the future. Not transfers, not resignations, not burnout. The future of the ward. The change was subtle at first. A therapist requested additional group materials. One nurse suggested starting a weekly veterans breakfast. An occupational therapist proposed a woodworking workshop. Small ideas, simple ideas. The kind people only shared when they believed something was worth building. For years, nobody had bothered. Why invest in a place everyone expected to fail? Why plan for a future nobody believed would arrive? Yet suddenly people were planning. And the reason was sitting behind the nurse's station reviewing patient charts. Emily Carter. The strange thing was that Emily didn't notice any of it. She was too busy working, too busy listening. Too busy helping people take the next step. One patient, one conversation, one day at a time. The biggest surprise came from Ethan Cole, not because he changed overnight. He didn't. Recovery never worked that way. But he started showing up, at breakfast, at physical therapy, at community meetings. Not participating much, mostly observing, but he showed up. And on the fourth floor, showing up mattered. One Tuesday morning, Emily walked into the common room carrying coffee. She nearly stopped. Ethan sat at a table with 3 other veterans. Playing cards, nobody else seemed surprised. Which was even more surprising, like the sight had already become normal. Ethan looked up, caught her staring, immediately frowned. "What?" Emily smiled. "Nothing." The former SEAL narrowed his eyes. "You were staring." Emily sat down. "I was observing." One of the veterans laughed. Ethan rolled his eyes, then returned to his cards. The moment lasted only seconds, but Emily couldn't stop smiling afterward. Because 2 months earlier, Ethan would have locked himself inside his room rather than sit with other people. Now he was arguing about card games. Progress often looked ridiculous from the outside, but progress was progress. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated the changes. Richard Hale certainly didn't. The administrator sat through another budget meeting later that week. The numbers frustrated him, not because they were bad, because they were improving. Patient engagement up, incident reports down. Family visitation increasing, community support growing. Every metric made closing the ward harder, and Richard still wanted it closed. The veterans unit occupied valuable space, generated limited revenue, required significant resources. To him, the equation remained simple. The emotional stories didn't change the financial reality. At least that's what he kept telling himself. Yet every report made the argument weaker, and he hated weak arguments. Back on the fourth floor, Emily faced a different challenge. A new veteran arrived. His name was Marcus Turner, former Army infantry, 37 years old, recently homeless, recently divorced, recently unemployed. His file read like a list of losses. When Emily entered his room for the first time, she found him packing a bag. That immediately caught her attention. He had arrived less than 24 hours earlier. "Going somewhere?" Marcus didn't look up. "Leaving." Emily leaned against the doorway. "You just got here." "I know." The answer came instantly, like he'd already rehearsed it. Emily studied him. People often threatened to leave. Most didn't actually mean it. Marcus did. She could see it. The determination, the fear, the exhaustion. Most importantly, the expectation of failure. He already believed the ward couldn't help him, which meant he would find evidence supporting that belief. People often did. Emily walked into the room, pulled up a chair, sat down. Marcus kept packing. Neither spoke for almost a minute. Finally, he looked up. Annoyed, "What?" Emily shrugged. "Nothing." The veteran frowned. "Then why are you sitting there?" Emily smiled. "Because if you're leaving, I figured I'd like to know your name first." The room became quiet. Marcus stared at her, trying to determine whether she was serious. The frustrating part was that she clearly was. Eventually, he laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the conversation wasn't going the way he expected. And for the first time that day, he stopped packing. Later that evening, Ethan found Emily completing paperwork near the nurse's station. He stood there awkwardly, waiting. Emily eventually looked up. "You need something." Ethan pointed down the hallway. "Marcus." Emily nodded. "What about him?" The former SEAL hesitated, then shrugged. "He won't listen to staff." Emily raised an eyebrow, and another pause then. "He might listen to me." The words surprised both of them, especially Ethan, because 6 weeks ago he would have laughed at the idea of helping another patient. Now he was volunteering without realizing it. Emily smiled. Ethan immediately regretted speaking. "What?" "Nothing." "You did that smile again." Emily laughed. "The observation smile?" "Yeah." The nurse shook her head. "I'm just glad you're here." Ethan looked away because part of him was glad too, though he'd never admit it out loud. The following afternoon, Marcus joined a group session, then another, then another. Nobody celebrated. Nobody made a big deal about it, but everyone noticed. especially Emily, and especially Ethan, who pretended not to. As summer approached, the atmosphere on the fourth floor continued changing. Walls once covered with hospital notices now displayed patient artwork. Community events filled bulletin boards. Family photographs appeared on bedside tables. The ward still faced challenges, patients still struggled, nightmares still happened. Bad days still existed, but hopelessness no longer controlled the entire floor. And that terrified Richard Hale more than he cared to admit, because the more successful the ward became, the harder it became to justify shutting it down. One evening, long after most visitors had gone home, Emily sat alone reviewing reports. The nurse's station was quiet, the hallway peaceful. For the first time all day, she had a moment to breathe. That's when Michelle approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Emily, then sat beside her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Michelle smiled. "You know what's funny?" Emily looked up. "What?" The older nurse glanced around the ward, then shook her head. "When you started here." A pause. "I was taking bets." Emily laughed. "Bets?" Michelle nodded. "How long you'd last." Emily nearly choked on her coffee. "Seriously? Seriously?" The 2 women laughed, then Michelle's expression softened. "I gave you 3 weeks." Emily smiled. "What happens now?" Michelle looked down the hallway, toward the veterans, toward the staff, toward the ward everyone once called impossible. Then she answered honestly. "Now I'm wondering how we survived before you got here." Emily didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. And for once, neither did Michelle, because some truths didn't need explaining. They simply needed acknowledging. Neither woman noticed the man standing at the elevator reading a letter. A retired Navy SEAL commander, hundreds of miles away. A man named David Mercer. A man who had just finished reading a recommendation from an old teammate. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been underlined twice. "If you ever want proof that people can come back from the edge, visit the 4th floor and ask for Emily Carter." David read the line again, then folded the letter, because for the first time in a long time, something had made him curious. 3 months after Emily arrived, something happened that nobody thought possible. The waiting list started growing, not because the hospital advertised the ward. Not because funding increased, not because administrators suddenly cared. The growth happened because veterans talked. One patient told another. A former Marine called an old Army buddy. Families shared stories. Social workers passed along recommendations. Word spread quietly through veteran communities if you were struggling. If you felt forgotten. If every other program had failed. There was a place that might help, the 4th floor, the graveyard, except people weren't calling it that anymore. They were calling it something else. The place where people came back. Emily didn't know any of this, at least not at first. She was too busy dealing with everyday problems. One patient refused medication. Another had a panic attack. A third missed therapy. The work never stopped, and that's exactly why she liked it. The moment you started focusing on recognition instead of people, you lost sight of why you were there. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that philosophy. Richard Hale certainly didn't. The hospital administrator sat staring at another quarterly report. The numbers should have made him happy. Most executives would have celebrated. Incidents down. Recovery rates improving. Patient retention increasing. Family engagement up nearly 40%. Instead, Richard felt irritated because every positive number made the ward harder to eliminate. The original closure proposal was quietly falling apart. Board members who once supported it were asking questions. Uncomfortable questions. Questions he didn't enjoy answering. Like why a supposedly failing unit was outperforming projections, or why former patients kept sending letters praising the staff, or why community donations had doubled. Richard closed the report, then looked toward the window. The 4th floor had become a problem, not because it was failing, because it wasn't. That same week, Ethan Cole did something that shocked everyone, including himself. He volunteered. The word spread through the ward in less than an hour. Frank Sullivan nearly fell out of his chair laughing. "You're kidding." Ethan glared at him. "I'm serious." That only made Frank laugh harder. For months, Ethan had avoided responsibility, avoided involvement, avoided people. Now he was sitting in a planning meeting helping organize a veterans mentorship group. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Ethan. Emily watched the exchange from across the room, trying not to smile, failing completely. Eventually, Ethan noticed. "What?" Emily shook her head. "Nothing. You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one where you're pretending not to be happy." Several veterans laughed. Emily rolled her eyes. The conversation moved on, but inside she couldn't stop thinking about how far he'd come. 3 months earlier, Ethan barely left his room. Now he was helping other veterans navigate recovery. Not because anyone asked him to, because he wanted to, and that mattered. A lot. 2 weeks later, Marcus Turner received a phone call. The former Army infantryman sat frozen in the common area long after the conversation ended. Emily eventually noticed. She approached carefully. "You okay?" Marcus looked up. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then he nodded, then shook his head, then laughed. The reaction confused her. Finally he managed to explain. "My son." Emily sat down beside him. "What about him?" Marcus stared at the floor. "He wants to see me." The words sounded almost unbelievable, as if saying them out loud might make them disappear. Emily smiled softly. "That's good." Marcus nodded. Tears filled his eyes. "I know." A pause. "I just didn't think I'd ever hear that again." Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some moments required presence more than words. Across the room, several veterans quietly watched. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone understood exactly what Marcus was feeling. Hope. Terrifying, beautiful hope. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, David Mercer finally booked his flight. The retired Navy SEAL commander had spent weeks hearing stories, reading letters, listening to former operators describe a nurse they'd never met. At first, he'd ignored it. Then he'd become curious. Now he wanted answers, not because he doubted the stories, because he couldn't explain them. Veterans with severe PTSD improving, patients reconnecting with families, people who had given up suddenly finding purpose again. David had spent most of his life around warriors. He understood combat. He understood leadership. He understood resilience. What he didn't understand was how one nurse seemed to be changing lives on such a massive scale. The stories felt exaggerated, almost impossible, and yet they kept coming. Eventually, curiosity won. 3 days later, he boarded a plane. Back on the 4th floor, nobody knew he was coming. Life continued normally. Morning rounds, therapy sessions, medication checks, family visits, recovery, slow, messy, beautiful recovery. Then a storm hit the city, a bad one. Power flickered. Rain hammered the windows, emergency rooms filled with accident victims. The entire hospital shifted into crisis mode. Most units locked down, staff rushed everywhere. The 4th floor wasn't spared. Several nurses became trapped on flooded roads. Others couldn't reach the hospital. Within hours, staffing levels dropped dangerously low. Emily volunteered to stay, then volunteered again, then worked 16 straight hours. Nobody was surprised. By now everyone expected it. The problem wasn't Emily. The problem was everyone else trying to keep up with her. Around midnight, Michelle found her completing patient rounds. "You need sleep." Emily laughed. "I need 3 more nurses." Michelle pointed toward a chair. "Sit." "No, Emily. No." Michelle sighed. The conversation felt familiar because it happened constantly. Emily took care of everyone except herself, and the people around her were starting to notice. At 2 in the morning, an alarm sounded from room 418. Several nurses immediately moved, so did Emily. They reached Ethan's room seconds later. The former SEAL sat upright in bed, breathing heavily. Disoriented, sweating, lost inside another nightmare. The room remained tense. Nobody moved too quickly. Nobody raised their voice. Eventually, Ethan realized where he was. The panic slowly faded. The shaking stopped. The nightmare released its grip. Emily remained beside him the entire time, not speaking, not pushing, just present. After several minutes, Ethan finally looked at her. "You should go home." Emily smiled tiredly. "So should you." For the first time in weeks, Ethan laughed, a real laugh. Even in the middle of a bad night, and somehow that felt important. The storm passed by morning, the hospital survived, the ward survived, and Emily showed up for another shift despite barely sleeping. That afternoon, Michelle handed her a stack of letters. "What are these?" Michelle smiled. "Fan mail." Emily groaned immediately. The older nurse laughed. "Former patients." Emily looked through the envelopes, thank you notes, holiday cards, family updates, photographs, stories, lives moving forward, lives rebuilding, lives continuing. One envelope contained a simple handwritten message, just one sentence. Emily read it twice. Then quietly folded the paper. Michelle noticed. "What did it say?" Emily hesitated, then smiled. It said, her voice softened, "Thank you for staying when everyone else left." Neither woman spoke for a moment because both understood exactly what that meant. Neither noticed the man stepping off an airplane several states away. A retired Navy SEAL commander carrying a duffel bag. A man named David Mercer. A man who would arrive at the hospital in less than 48 hours. And when he finally stepped onto the fourth floor, the first thing he would ask was a question nobody expected. "Where can I find Nurse Emily Carter?" David Mercer arrived on a Tuesday morning. The fourth floor looked nothing like he expected. That was the first thing he noticed, not because the ward was impressive, because it felt alive. Over the years, David had visited dozens of veteran recovery facilities. Some were excellent, some were terrible, most fell somewhere in between, but they all shared one thing in common: a certain heaviness, a feeling that people were surviving rather than living. The fourth floor felt different. The moment the elevator doors opened, he sensed it. Veterans sat together in the common room. A therapist laughed at something one of the patients said. Someone was making coffee. Someone else was teaching another veteran how to play chess. The atmosphere wasn't perfect, but it felt human, and that immediately caught his attention. David walked toward the nurse's station. A young nurse looked up. "Can I help you?" David nodded. "I'm looking for Emily Carter." The nurse smiled. Of course she did. Everyone seemed to smile when Emily's name came up. That was another thing David noticed. "She's with a patient right now." David nodded. "No rush." The nurse pointed toward a waiting area. "You're welcome to sit." David thanked her and walked away. As he passed the common room, several veterans glanced up. One of them froze, then blinked twice. The veteran stood immediately. David recognized him before he even spoke. Ethan Cole, older, thinner, but unmistakably Ethan. For a second, neither man moved. Then Ethan laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind David hadn't heard from him in years. "You're kidding." David smiled. "Good to see you too." Several nearby veterans looked confused. Ethan shook his head. "I thought you were in Montana." "I was." "What are you doing here?" David looked around the ward, then smiled. "I'm starting to figure that out." The two men shook hands. A simple gesture, yet everyone nearby noticed something unusual: respect, real respect. The kind earned over decades, not demanded, not announced. Earned. David studied Ethan carefully. The difference shocked him. The letters hadn't prepared him. The stories hadn't prepared him. Nothing had. This wasn't the same man he'd known a year earlier. The bitterness was still there. The scars were still there, but the hopelessness wasn't, and that mattered a lot. Half an hour later, Emily finally appeared. She walked out of a patient room carrying a chart and nearly walked straight past him. Then she stopped, turned around, looked confused. The older man standing near the nurse's station looked vaguely familiar, not personally, professionally, like someone who had spent years carrying responsibility. David smiled. "Emily Carter." She nodded yes. For a second, neither spoke. Then David extended his hand. "David Mercer." Emily shook it. "Nice to meet you." The introduction felt strangely normal, which immediately amused David, because the woman he'd flown across the country to meet had absolutely no idea who he was or why he was there. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Emily looked at the stack of charts in her arms, then at the clock, then back at David. "I've got 7 minutes." David laughed. "That'll do." They sat in the small staff cafeteria. David expected confidence, expected charisma, expected some obvious explanation for what he'd been hearing. Instead, Emily spent most of the conversation asking questions about him. It took 20 minutes before David realized something. She genuinely wasn't interested in talking about herself. Most people enjoyed discussing accomplishments. Emily seemed uncomfortable every time the conversation drifted in that direction. Eventually, David asked directly, "Why this ward?" Emily looked up from her coffee. "What do you mean?" "The veterans unit." A pause. "You could work anywhere." Emily smiled faintly, not because the question was funny, because she'd been asked it many times. "My father was a veteran." David nodded slowly. The answer felt important. Emily stared into her coffee for a moment. "He struggled after coming home." Another pause. "He wasn't a bad man." Her voice softened. "He was just carrying things nobody else could see." David remained silent, listening, the same way she listened to everyone else. He spent years pretending he was okay. She laughed softly, got very good at it too. The smile disappeared almost immediately. Eventually, he stopped pretending. The silence that followed explained everything. David didn't need details, didn't need dates, didn't need a full story. He understood. Veterans usually did. Emily looked back up. "I couldn't help him." The words came quietly, almost casually. Yet David felt the weight behind them, years of it. "I spent a long time wishing I could have done more." She shrugged, then smiled. "So now I do what I can." The simplicity of the answer hit harder than any speech could have. No dramatic mission. No grand philosophy. No hidden military background, just a daughter who lost her father and decided not to let other families experience the same thing. David understood why people followed her now. That afternoon he spent hours walking through the ward, observing, listening, learning. Everywhere he went he heard stories. Not from staff, from veterans. One talked about reconnecting with his son. Another discussed returning to work. Another described attending a family reunion for the first time in 6 years. The details changed. The pattern didn't. Every story eventually led back to Emily, not because she solved their problems, because she stayed long enough to help them solve their own. By evening, David found himself sitting in the common room with Ethan. Several veterans played cards nearby. Others watched television. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable, normal. David couldn't stop looking around. Finally, Ethan noticed. "What?" David shook his head. "I've never seen this place." Ethan frowned. "What place?" David gestured toward the ward. "Any place like this." The former SEAL followed his gaze, then smiled. "Yeah." For a moment, neither spoke. Then David asked the question that had been bothering him all day. What would have happened if she never showed up? The room fell quiet, not dramatically, just naturally, because everyone nearby had heard the question, and everyone knew the answer. Ethan looked down at the cards in his hands, then toward the hallway, then toward the nurse's station where Emily was helping a patient complete paperwork. Finally, he answered. "Most of us would have disappeared." The honesty in his voice stunned David, because it wasn't exaggeration, it wasn't sentiment, it was truth, raw truth. And for the first time since arriving, David understood why his old teammate had underlined that sentence in the letter. If you ever want proof that people can come back from the edge, visit the 4th floor and ask for Emily Carter. The teammate had been wrong about one thing. David hadn't found proof that people could come back from the edge. He'd found proof that sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to walk away. What David didn't know was that while he sat in the common room, a meeting was taking place 2 floors below. A meeting involving Richard Hale, several board members, and a proposal that could destroy everything Emily had built. Because despite all the progress, despite all the recovery, despite all the lives changing, someone still wanted the 4th floor gone. The board meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. For Richard Hale, that was the problem. The decision should have been easy. 6 months earlier it would have been. Back then, the Veterans Recovery Unit was struggling. Staff turnover was constant. Patient outcomes were poor. Incidents happened weekly. The closure proposal practically wrote itself. Now everything was different, and Richard hated it. One board member flipped through a report and frowned. "These numbers don't match the projections from last year." Richard forced a smile. "No." Another member adjusted her glasses. "Patient engagement is up nearly 60%. A third looked up from the packet. "Family visitation has doubled." Silence followed, the kind Richard had learned to dislike. Because silence meant people were thinking, and thinking made them harder to control. The chairman finally spoke. "So why exactly are we discussing closure again?" Richard already knew the answer. The problem was that saying it out loud sounded worse every time he heard it. "We have financial concerns." The chairman nodded slowly, then pointed at another report. "Yet donations have increased." Another pause. "Volunteer support has increased." Another. "Community partnerships have increased." Richard felt the conversation slipping away. For the first time, several board members looked unconvinced, and that worried him a lot. Upstairs, nobody knew the meeting was happening. The 4th floor continued operating normally. Patients attended therapy, families visited, staff completed rounds, recovery continued, life continued. Emily spent most of the afternoon helping Marcus prepare for an important visit. His son was coming, the first visit in nearly 2 years. Marcus had changed shirts 3 times, checked his appearance 6, and paced the hallway enough to wear a path into the floor. Emily finally laughed. "You're making everyone nervous." Marcus pointed at her. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." "No, you don't." The former soldier looked genuinely terrified. Emily smiled. "You're more scared of your son than you were of combat." Several nearby veterans burst out laughing. Marcus glared at them, which only made them laugh harder. Even Ethan was smiling, and that alone would have seemed impossible a few months earlier. David Mercer watched the interaction from the common room. The more time he spent on the 4th floor, the more confused he became. Not because he couldn't see the change, because he could. The change was obvious. The confusing part was Emily herself. She wasn't charismatic, she wasn't loud. She didn't give speeches, she didn't act like a leader, yet somehow everyone followed her example. Veterans trusted her, staff respected her, families appreciated her, and she seemed completely unaware of it. David had spent decades studying leadership. Most people tried to earn influence. Emily earned it by accident. Later that evening, he found Ethan sitting alone near the window. The former SEAL looked healthier, stronger, more present, but old habits died hard. He still liked quiet corners. David sat beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. Eventually, David nodded toward the nurse's station. Emily was helping an elderly veteran complete paperwork. Nothing dramatic, nothing important, at least on the surface. What happens if she leaves? Ethan didn't answer right away. The question lingered, then he shook his head. I don't know. David looked surprised. Ethan laughed softly. 6 months ago, I would have said everyone goes backwards. A pause, now. Another pause. Now I think she'd be angry if we did. David smiled. That sounded exactly right, because Emily had spent months teaching veterans to believe in themselves, not depend on her. There was a difference, a very important difference. The next morning, David received another surprise, a stack of letters, former patients, families, veterans who had already left the program. The nurses had been collecting them for months. Most were simple thank you notes. Some included photographs. Others included life updates, jobs. Weddings, birthdays, reunions, second chances. David spent nearly an hour reading them. One letter came from a former Marine. The handwriting was rough, uneven, the kind produced by injured hands. The final paragraph caught David's attention. When I arrived, I thought the hospital was my last stop. Nurse Carter never treated me like a problem that needed fixing. She treated me like a man worth knowing. That's when everything started changing. David read the sentence twice, then a third time, because every story seemed to contain the same theme, not treatment, not medicine, not programs, connection. Emily made people feel seen, and once people felt seen, they started fighting again. That afternoon, Marcus's son arrived. The entire ward seemed invested, even veterans pretending they weren't. Several patients casually positioned themselves near common areas. Others suddenly found reasons to walk through the hallway. Nobody wanted to miss it. Marcus stood near the elevator, looking more nervous than any combat veteran should. Then the doors opened. A teenage boy stepped out. For a second, nobody moved. Neither knew what to say, neither knew where to begin. 2 years of silence stood between them. Then the boy smiled, just slightly. Marcus immediately started crying. The hallway collectively lost the battle against their emotions. Several nurses looked away. One therapist wiped her eyes. Even David felt his throat tight. The reunion wasn't dramatic, no speeches, no movie moment, just a father hugging his son. And somehow that made it even more powerful. David looked around. The veterans were smiling, the staff were smiling, even Ethan looked emotional. Then David noticed something. Emily wasn't watching. She'd quietly walked away, back to work, back to helping someone else like she always did. Like she genuinely believed moments like this belonged to other people, not her. And for the first time, David understood why veterans trusted her so much, because she never made their victories about herself. That evening, Richard Hale visited the 4th floor. He rarely came anymore. The atmosphere annoyed him. Too many reminders that his predictions had been wrong. As he walked through the ward, something felt different. People seemed happier, stronger, connected. The changes were impossible to ignore now. Then he saw something that stopped him cold. A bulletin board near the common room, covered in photographs, family reunions. Graduations, job offers, recovery milestones, dozens of them, each representing a life moving forward. At the top, someone had pinned a handwritten sign. Richard stepped closer. The sign simply read, "People everyone else gave up on." His jaw tightened, because suddenly the board wasn't celebrating patience. It was exposing a truth he didn't want anyone thinking about. The 4th floor had succeeded because people stopped giving up, which meant every person who had abandoned the ward before looked worse by comparison, including him. Later that night, David Mercer sat alone in the common room. The ward had gone quiet. Most patients were asleep, the lights dimmed, the building peaceful. For several minutes he stared at the photographs on the bulletin board. Then he made a decision, a simple one but important. He picked up his phone and called someone. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, David looked toward the nurse's station, toward the hallway, toward everything Emily had built. Because if Richard Hale planned to fight for closure, He was about to discover something. Veterans weren't the only people paying attention anymore. And David Mercer had no intention of letting the fourth floor disappear without a fight. The next week began with a rumor. Nobody knew where it started. Nobody knew who said it first. But by Tuesday morning, almost every staff member had heard some version of it. The board was coming, not one member, all of them, along with senior administrators, department heads, financial consultants, the kind of visit that made people nervous, especially in hospitals, because large groups of executives rarely appeared without a reason. Michelle heard it first from a supervisor. A therapist heard it from human resources. An orderly heard it from someone in accounting. By lunchtime, the entire fourth floor was talking about it, everyone except Emily. She was too busy helping patients to pay attention. When Michelle finally told her, Emily barely looked up from her paperwork. The board, Michelle nodded. Next week. Emily shrugged. Okay. Michelle stared at her. That's it. Emily looked confused. What am I supposed to do? The older nurse laughed. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have worried. Most people would have spent days preparing. Emily simply returned to work, which somehow made Michelle laugh even harder. David Mercer wasn't laughing. He knew exactly why the board was coming, because he had arranged it. Not directly, but close enough. The phone call he'd made a few nights earlier had reached people with influence. People who cared about veterans, people who asked uncomfortable questions, people who didn't like hearing that a successful recovery unit might be shut down for financial reasons. Now the board wanted a closer look, a real look, not spreadsheets, not reports, reality. And David intended to make sure they saw it. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole faced a challenge of his own. The job offer sitting on his bedside table. For weeks it had remained there, untouched, unread, ignored. Every day he looked at it. Every day he found a reason not to call. Not to commit, not to move forward. The fear wasn't failure. Not exactly. The fear was hope. Because hope created expectations, and expectations could be broken. One afternoon, Emily found him staring at the envelope again. She didn't need to ask. The expression on his face told her everything. Still thinking, Ethan looked up, still avoiding. Emily nodded, at least he was honest. The former SEAL leaned back, then laughed softly. You know what's funny? What? 6 months ago I couldn't imagine having a future. A pause. Now I'm scared of losing one. Emily smiled, because that wasn't a step backward, it was proof of growth. People only feared losing things they cared about, and Ethan finally cared again. Across the ward, another milestone arrived. Frank Sullivan's daughter visited for the 4th time in a month. That alone would have seemed impossible a year earlier. This time she brought her children. The 2 grandchildren Frank hadn't seen in years. The reunion happened in the common room. Several veterans pretended not to watch, failed miserably. One little girl immediately climbed into Frank's lap. The former Army Ranger completely lost the ability to speak. The entire room melted. Even Marcus Turner looked emotional. David Mercer happened to witness the scene. He quietly stepped back into the hallway, giving the family privacy, but the image stayed with him. Because every time he thought he'd seen the strongest example of what Emily built. Another one appeared, and each seemed more powerful than the last. 3 days before the board visit, Richard Hale made a mistake. A big one. It happened during a staff meeting. Frustration finally got the better of him. Someone mentioned the veterans unit. Someone else mentioned patient outcomes. Then someone brought up Emily. The room immediately grew uncomfortable because Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. A supervisor noticed, then another, then another. Finally, Richard spoke. The ward's improvements are being exaggerated. The room became silent. Several people exchanged looks. Richard continued. Recovery is complicated. Nobody disagreed. One person doesn't transform an entire unit. Again, nobody disagreed, but the problem wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, the bitterness. The irritation, the resentment. For months he'd hidden it. Now everyone saw it, and once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Later that evening, David heard about the meeting. His reaction surprised even him, because he felt angry, not annoyed, not disappointed, angry. For years he had watched people talk about veterans as statistics, programs, budgets, expenses. Now he was watching the same thing happen again. Only this time he knew the people involved. He knew Ethan, he knew Frank, he knew Marcus, he knew what the 4th floor meant to them. And suddenly the issue felt personal, very personal. The night before the board visit, the ward felt unusually quiet. Even the patients noticed. Anxiety hung in the air. Nobody talked about it directly, but everyone felt it. Something important was coming. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Clouds covered the sky. Rain threatened. The hospital buzzed with activity. Executives arrived early. Staff prepared reports. Department heads reviewed presentations. Everyone seemed tense, everyone except Emily. She spent the morning helping a veteran complete discharge paperwork, then assisted another patient during physical therapy, then checked medications. Just another day. That was the funny thing about people like Emily. No matter how important the moment became, they still focused on the person standing in front of them. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the elevator doors opened. The board had arrived. 7 members, 3 administrators, several department heads. Richard Hale leading the group. David Mercer stood near the common room watching. Ethan stood beside him. "So this is it?" David nodded. "Looks like it." The former SEAL folded his arms. Neither man looked particularly nervous, because both knew something Richard Hale didn't. The truth was on the 4th floor's side, and truth tends to perform well when people finally pay attention to it. As the group approached the nurse's station, Richard began his presentation. Numbers, statistics, reports. The usual, then one board member interrupted. A woman in her 60s, sharp eyes. Sharp mind, the kind of person who noticed details. She looked around the ward, then toward Richard, then asked a question that changed everything. A simple question, one nobody expected, one that immediately made Richard uncomfortable. She pointed toward the busy nurse helping a veteran fill out paperwork, then asked, "Before we go any further," a pause, "which one is Emily Carter?" For a moment nobody answered. The board member stood waiting. Her question hung in the air, simple, direct, unexpected. "Which one is Emily Carter?" Richard Hale felt his stomach tighten. Because he knew exactly where this was heading. The board members hadn't come to hear another presentation. They had come to see results, and results were standing 20 feet away helping a veteran fill out disability paperwork. The woman followed Richard's gaze, then looked toward Emily. "That's her." Richard forced a smile. "Yes." The board member seemed surprised, not disappointed, just surprised. Emily didn't look extraordinary. She wasn't giving a speech. She wasn't leading a meeting. She wasn't standing in front of a presentation board. She was sitting beside an elderly veteran explaining paperwork line by line. The board member watched quietly, then asked another question. "Does she know we're here?" Richard hesitated, then answered honestly. "No." The woman smiled. For some reason, that answer seemed to impress her. Across the room, Emily finally noticed the group. Several executives, board members, administrators. People in expensive suits, not exactly subtle. Michelle immediately appeared beside her. "They want to meet you." Emily looked confused. "Why?" Michelle laughed. "You tell me." Emily glanced toward the group, then back toward the veteran she was helping. "I'm busy." Michelle nearly choked. "You can't tell the board you're busy." Emily looked genuinely puzzled. "Why not?" The older nurse stared at her, then burst out laughing. A few nearby staff members joined her, because somehow that response was exactly what everyone expected from Emily Carter. A few minutes later, the introductions finally happened. Board members shook hands, asked questions, offered polite compliments. Emily thanked them, then immediately redirected attention toward the patients, which David Mercer noticed and appreciated a lot. One board member eventually asked the obvious question, "How did you do it?" Emily blinked. "Do what?" The woman gestured around the ward, the veterans, the atmosphere, the changes, all this. Emily looked around, then shrugged. "I didn't." Several people exchanged confused looks. The board member frowned. "According to everyone we've spoken to, you did." Emily shook her head. "No," then pointed toward the veterans. "They did." The answer sounded simple, almost frustratingly simple, yet David smiled because it was exactly what he'd expected. The woman studied Emily carefully, trying to determine whether she was being modest. Eventually, she realized something. Emily genuinely believed it. The tour continued, except now something had changed. The board stopped listening to administrators. They started listening to veterans, and that created a problem for Richard Hale. A very big problem, because veterans weren't discussing budgets. They weren't discussing costs. They weren't discussing spreadsheets. They were discussing their lives. Frank Sullivan told them about reconnecting with his daughter. Marcus spoke about seeing his son again. Another veteran talked about returning to work. Another discussed sobriety. Another described sleeping through the night for the first time in years. Story after story, person after person. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Recovery wasn't theoretical anymore. It was standing right in front of them. Living, breathing, talking. David watched the board members carefully. Years in special operations had taught him how to read people, and what he saw interested him. Their expressions were changing, curiosity becoming respect, respect becoming admiration. Admiration becoming something else. Conviction. They were starting to believe, not because of presentations, because of evidence, real evidence. The kind nobody could fake. Then Ethan Cole stood up. Nobody asked him to, nobody expected him to, but suddenly he was on his feet. The room became quiet. Even Richard looked surprised, because everyone knew Ethan's history. The isolation, the anger, the withdrawal, the years spent refusing help. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Being the center of attention still wasn't his favorite thing, but he remained standing, and after a few seconds he spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be here." The room listened. "I don't mean this hospital." A pause. "I mean alive." Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. The former SEAL looked around the ward, then toward Emily, then away again, as if eye contact made honesty harder. "I spent years waiting for things to end." His voice remained calm, steady. The words hit harder because of it. No plans, another pause, no future. Another, no reason. The room stayed silent. Ethan slowly shook his head, then laughed, a small laugh, the kind people use when remembering someone they used to be. "I figured eventually everybody would stop trying." His eyes drifted toward Emily. They almost did. The sentence landed heavily because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Then Ethan smiled, a real smile, small but real. She didn't. Silence, absolute silence. Several board members looked emotional. One therapist wiped away tears. Even Michelle looked away for a second because she'd known Ethan from the beginning. She remembered the man he'd been, and the difference felt overwhelming. Richard Hale knew he was losing, not the meeting, the narrative. For months he'd controlled the conversation. Now he couldn't. Because stories were replacing spreadsheets, lives were replacing projections, people were replacing numbers, and numbers were the only battlefield where he had an advantage. The final blow came unexpectedly. One of the board members stopped near the bulletin board, the same one Richard had seen earlier. The one covered with photographs, recovery milestones, family reunions, new jobs, second chances. At the center sat a photograph taken only a week earlier, Marcus and his son, smiling together. The board member stared at it, then turned toward Richard. "How much would it cost to replace this program?" Richard opened his mouth, then stopped, because there wasn't an answer, not a real one. You could replace beds, replace equipment, replace buildings, but replacing hope, that wasn't something accountants calculated, and for the first time all day. Richard had nothing to say. The tour ended shortly afterward. Board members gathered near the elevators. Quiet conversations filled the hallway. Discussions, observations, decisions. David stood nearby watching, waiting, because he already knew what was happening. The fourth floor had passed the test. The only question remaining was what happened next. As the elevator doors opened, the board chair turned toward David, then toward Emily, then toward the ward. She smiled. A small smile, but a meaningful one. And before stepping into the elevator, she said something that immediately caught everyone's attention. "We'd like Nurse Carter at next week's board meeting." The hallway fell silent. Emily looked genuinely alarmed. Michelle looked delighted. Richard Hale looked sick. And David Mercer smiled for the first time all day. Because he had a feeling the most important battle hadn't happened yet. It was waiting 1 week away, inside a boardroom, where the future of the fourth floor would finally be decided. The week between the board visit and the meeting felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet. The veterans noticed it. The staff noticed it. Even Emily noticed it. Nobody knew what decision the board would make. Nobody knew what had been discussed after the tour ended. And nobody knew why Richard Hale had practically disappeared from the fourth floor. The uncertainty lingered, yet life continued, because life always continued. Patients attended therapy, families visited, recovery moved forward, one day at a time. 3 days before the meeting, Ethan Cole accepted the job. The moment arrived without ceremony, no dramatic speech, no grand announcement. He simply picked up the phone and made the call. 5 minutes later, he walked into the common room, sat down, and stared at the floor. Frank Sullivan immediately noticed. "You look weird." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Thanks." Frank pointed at him. "No, seriously." A pause. "You look terrified." Several veterans laughed. Ethan hated how accurate that was. Finally, he sighed, then said the words nobody expected to hear. "I took the job." The room froze for about half a second, then exploded. Cheers, laughter, applause. One veteran nearly spilled his coffee. Another actually stood up. The reaction embarrassed Ethan immediately, which only made everyone celebrate harder. Emily arrived seconds later, completely confused. What happened? Marcus pointed toward Ethan. He finally stopped being stubborn. The entire room erupted again, even Emily laughed, and for the first time in years. Ethan wasn't afraid of the future. Nervous, absolutely, terrified, definitely, but not hopeless, and that made all the difference. The night before the board meeting, David Mercer sat alone in a hotel room. A folder rested on the table. Inside were photographs, patient outcomes, letters, recovery statistics, family testimonies, everything he'd collected during his time on the 4th floor. He slowly flipped through the pages. Not because the board needed convincing, because he wanted to remember every face, every story, every victory. Then he stopped at a photograph. Frank Sullivan standing beside his daughter and grandchildren, all smiling. David stared at it for a long time, because 6 months earlier that picture didn't exist. And neither did the life behind it. Eventually he closed the folder. Tomorrow mattered, not because of budgets, not because of politics, because people were counting on the outcome. The board meeting began at 9 o'clock. The room felt different from the start. Nobody joked, nobody chatted, nobody wasted time. The agenda was simple. One item, the future of the Veterans Recovery Unit. Emily sat near the back, completely uncomfortable. She would have preferred being anywhere else. A patient room, a therapy session, a medication round, anywhere. Boardrooms weren't her environment, never had been, never would be. Across the room, Richard Hale reviewed notes. For weeks he had prepared arguments. Financial concerns, resource allocation, long-term planning. The same points he'd repeated for months. The problem was that they sounded weaker now, much weaker, and he knew it. The chairman opened the meeting. Reports were reviewed, numbers discussed. Questions answered. Then came the moment everyone expected. Richard Hale stood, walked to the front, and began his presentation. For nearly 20 minutes he spoke. Budgets, costs, operational concerns, future projections. The language was professional, polished, careful. When he finished, the room remained quiet. No applause, no reactions, just silence. Then the chairman nodded toward David Mercer. "Commander." David stood. The room immediately focused on him, not because of rank, because everyone knew why he was there. David carried no presentation, no charts, no slides, just a folder. He placed it on the table, then looked around the room. "I've spent most of my adult life evaluating people." The room listened. "I've led teams in combat." A pause. "I've managed high-risk operations." Another pause, "and I've learned something important." The room remained silent. David continued. "When people matter, numbers only tell part of the story." Several board members nodded. Richard remained expressionless. David opened the folder, then removed a photograph, Frank and his family. He held it up. 6 months ago, this reunion wasn't possible. Another photograph, Marcus and his son. Neither was this. Another, a veteran celebrating a year of sobriety. Another, a patient returning to work. Story after story, life after life. Each photograph representing something statistics couldn't capture. Eventually, David set the pictures down, then looked directly at the board. "You've heard budget discussions." A pause. "You've reviewed reports." Another pause. "Now I'd like you to hear from the people those reports are about." The room became very quiet because several veterans were standing near the doorway. Ethan, Frank, Marcus, others not planned, not rehearsed, just present. The board chair smiled, then nodded. "Let's hear them." Frank spoke first. Then Marcus, then another veteran, each story different, each outcome unique, yet all pointing toward the same truth. The 4th floor worked, not perfectly, not magically, but undeniably. The board listened, really listened. No interruptions, no distractions, no phones, just attention. Then Ethan stood, and the room immediately settled. The former SEAL looked around, then toward the board, then toward Emily. Finally, he took a breath. "I used to think recovery meant becoming who you were before." Silence. Ethan shook his head. "I was wrong." The room listened. "I'm never going to be who I was before." A pause. "None of us are." Several veterans nodded because they understood more than anyone. Ethan continued. "The goal isn't getting your old life back." His eyes shifted toward Emily. "It's building a new one." The words hit the room with enormous force. Because they were true, simple, honest, true, and everyone knew it. When Ethan sat down, nobody spoke for several seconds. The atmosphere had changed, completely. The discussion wasn't about whether the ward mattered anymore. That question had already been answered. The only question left was what the board would do about it. The chairman finally folded his hands, then looked around the room. Board members, administrators, veterans, staff. Emily, everyone. And then he asked the question Richard Hale had been dreading, the question that would determine everything. If the unit is producing results like these, a pause. Why exactly were we trying to close it? The question hung over the room. Nobody answered immediately. Not Richard Hale, not the administrators, not the board members. Because for the first time since the discussion began, there wasn't a good answer. The chairman looked toward Richard again, patiently, waiting. The administrator cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, then glanced down at his notes. For the first time in years, the notes weren't helping. Because numbers had carried him through every previous meeting. Numbers, projections, budgets, percentages. Now he was facing something numbers couldn't defeat. People, real people, sitting 10 feet away, living proof that the fourth floor worked. Eventually, Richard spoke. We made decisions based on the information available at the time. The answer sounded weak the moment it left his mouth. Everyone knew it, including him. The chairman slowly nodded, then folded his hands. And what does the information say now? Silence, complete silence, because everybody already knew the answer. The information said the ward worked. The information said lives were improving. The information said families were reconnecting. The information said veterans were recovering. The information said closing the unit would be a mistake, a very expensive mistake, a very public mistake, and suddenly everyone in the room understood it. The board entered executive discussion. Staff stepped outside, veterans stepped outside, administrators stepped outside, the doors closed, the waiting began for nearly 40 minutes. Nobody liked waiting, especially veterans, especially nurses. The hallway outside the boardroom filled with nervous energy. Frank Sullivan paced. Marcus checked his phone every 30 seconds. Michelle drank enough coffee to concern several people. Even Ethan looked tense, though he'd never admit it. Emily sat quietly near a window, watching rain slide down the glass, the same way she always did when things felt outside her control. David eventually walked over, took the seat beside her. For a while neither spoke, then David smiled. You know they're talking about you in there. Emily groaned. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. David laughed. The response somehow didn't surprise him. Most people would enjoy that. Emily looked out the window. Most people are strange. That made David laugh even harder. A few nearby veterans glanced over, confused, because they rarely saw a retired Navy SEAL commander laughing like that. The boardroom doors finally opened. Conversations stopped instantly. Everyone stood. The chairman stepped into the hallway, the rest of the board behind him. Nobody smiled. Nobody frowned. Their expressions remained unreadable, which somehow made the moment worse. The chairman looked around, then spoke. The board has reached a decision. The hallway became completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. We have voted unanimously. A pause. The Veterans Recovery Unit will remain open. For half a second, nobody reacted. As if nobody trusted what they heard, then everything exploded. Cheers, applause, laughter, relief. The hallway erupted. Several veterans hugged each other. Frank actually cried. Marcus didn't even try hiding it. Michelle looked ready to tackle someone. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Months of uncertainty disappearing in seconds, but the chairman wasn't finished. He raised a hand. Slowly, the noise settled. There is more. The room quieted again. The chairman looked toward Emily, then smiled. The board has also approved expanded funding. More applause, more cheers, another pause. Additional staff positions. The celebration grew louder, and a permanent commitment to the program moving forward. By now, several people were openly crying, including some who insisted they weren't. Richard Hale stood quietly near the back, watching everything, watching the veterans, watching the staff, watching the celebration. For a long time, he said nothing. Then something unexpected happened. He walked toward Emily. The hallway gradually noticed. Conversations slowed. People watched. Richard stopped in front of her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, he extended his hand. I was wrong. The hallway went silent. Because nobody expected it, least of all Emily. Richard looked around the ward, then back at her. I should have seen it sooner. The admission wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but it was honest, and honesty mattered. Emily shook his hand, then smiled. It's okay. The administrator laughed softly. No, a pause. It really isn't. For the first time in months, both smiled, and something quietly ended. Several weeks later, life returned to normal, or at least as normal as the fourth floor ever became. Patients continued recovering, families continued visiting, staff continued working, the mission continued. Only now it had support, resources, a future. One afternoon, Ethan Cole appeared at the nurse's station carrying a duffel bag. Emily immediately noticed. So, Ethan nodded. So, the job was starting, the next chapter, the next life, the future he'd spent years avoiding. Now it was finally here. Several veterans gathered nearby, watching, waiting, because everyone knew what this moment meant. Ethan looked around the ward, the rooms, the hallways, the people, his people. Then he looked toward Emily. For a second, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan smiled, a genuine smile. The kind that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. You know, Emily raised an eyebrow. What? The former SEAL adjusted the strap on his bag. When you knocked on my door that first day. A pause. I almost told you to get lost. The hallway laughed. Emily smiled. Almost. Ethan laughed too. Okay. Another pause. I definitely told you to get lost. That earned even louder laughter. Then the humor faded, the moment becoming something deeper, something more important. Ethan looked directly at her, his voice quieter now. Thanks for coming back anyway. The hallway became silent, because everyone understood what those words really meant. Not just the door, not just that day, every difficult conversation, every setback, every moment she stayed when leaving would have been easier. Emily smiled, a little sadly, a little proudly. Then simply nodded, because she understood too. 6 months later, David Mercer returned. Not because anyone invited him, because he wanted to see the ward again. The elevator doors opened, and for a moment he just stood there, looking, absorbing, remembering. The transformation was unbelievable. New staff, new programs. More veterans, more families, more life. The place felt completely different, yet somehow exactly the same. Then he noticed something mounted on the wall near the nurse's station. A bronze plaque, simple, elegant. New. David walked closer, read the inscription, then smiled. The plaque didn't mention donations. It didn't mention budgets. It didn't mention board decisions. It simply read, dedicated to the veterans who refused to quit, and to those who refused to quit on them. David stared at the words for a long moment, then looked around, toward the common room, toward the patients, toward the future, and finally toward Emily, who was helping another veteran, exactly as she always had, completely unaware he was watching. David laughed softly, because some things never changed, and maybe that was the point. Years earlier, people had called the fourth floor the graveyard. The place where careers ended, the place where hope disappeared. Nobody called it that anymore. The veterans had given it a new name, a name that appeared nowhere in official records, nowhere in hospital paperwork, nowhere except the hearts of the people whose lives had been rebuilt there. They called it Second Chance. And every day, someone new walked through its doors hoping for one. Most found it, because one quiet nurse had refused to believe they were beyond saving. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything.